This is an RNZ podcast.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Ryan. Each week, our political commentators analyse the latest happenings in Parliament and beyond. Listen live on 9 to noon each Monday, just after the 11 o'clock news, or right here on this podcast. Let's get into it. Our political commentators today are Neale Jones and Liam Hehir. Kia ora koroa to both of you.
Morena.
Good morning.
Just lost your disclaimers, so you're going to have to run through them yourself. Go for it, Neale.
Neale Jones is Director of Public Affairs firm Capital. He's former Chief of Staff to Labour leader Jacinda Ardern, and before that Andrew Little.
And Liam.
I am a political commentator in the great city of Palmerston North. I'm a lawyer and a National Party member.
There we go. Thanks very much. Now, the government last week really heavied up the messaging over the impacts of the Middle East war on fuel. We had Nicola Willis, the Finance Minister, front and centre at various briefings. And for a while it looked like we were having a return to the 1pm briefing. Undoubtedly, the outlook and the prospects for this in terms of needing to actively manage fuel, things have worsened, but still that reassurance that we have fuel supplies at the moment and more on the water. Liam, how did you read how things unfolded last week?
I don't think it was that great. I mean, having said that, I'm not sure what any government could do. In some ways, you do kind of see it as a return to that sort of emergency kind of mindset. The difference is, of course, is that this is caused by a geopolitical crisis. And when the Labour government had to respond to COVID, it was an unambiguous kind of thing. Everyone was against the pandemic.
Just waiting to see if Liam's going to come back to us. You want to pick up, Neale?
Sure. Look, I think this is a critical week for the government, or critical moment for the government. Crises can make or break a government. I think they'd be hoping for John Key in the GFC, where he entered as Prime Minister with a lot of goodwill around his economic skills and background. I think the challenge this government's got is that this is an inflation and economic growth shock, and this government's entire promise has been to grow the economy and to get the cost of living down. And they have failed on both, and the public believe they've failed on both. So they enter without a lot of goodwill, I think, in those areas. I think the other challenge they face is, the obvious first thing to say it's not out is we were growing, the plan was working, and then this hit us. Well, that's not going to happen. We prepared New Zealand for it. Well, they didn't. I mean, I see today, belatedly, they've announced some electrification for EVs, but they've spent their whole term, repealing the clean car mandate. They've removed the Giddy Fund, which was decarbonising industry. Their plan for dry years was to build an LNG terminal at a time when LNG is being blockaded or blown up in the Middle East. So I think their culture wars around oil and gas and anti-climate action has actually made New Zealand less prepared for this shock. And the third one is we're protecting you through it. And we'll wait and see what Nicola Willis has to say. I am hopeful there's some generous support for people on low incomes. But there's a lot more they could be doing and should be doing. But they've got no money. And they've spent the last year talking about how Labour spent too much during the COVID crisis. They've kind of talked themselves into a corner too.
Okay, back to you, Liam.
Yeah, look, I think that there is a lot there. I think that it doesn't really work, I don't think, and voters won't necessarily buy the idea that anything that National has done in the 2.5 years of government would have ameliorated what we're now facing. Because what we're facing is truly an external and a short-term kind of shock. But what Neale is completely correct about is that the government of the day ends up holding the bag. The National Party didn't cause this crisis in the Middle East, but equally Labour didn't cause the Suez Canal to get blocked up, which caused a real supply spike or a supply constraint in terms of goods and services, and which contributed to inflation. And the government of the day just ends up holding the bag one way or the other. Now, the only thing that the government can do is look like it's in command of the situation. And this government can't do that for a number of reasons. One of them is that the government can't be upfront and honest about the cause of the problem. The government has to toe the line diplomatically to be very, very careful of not offending the United States. And so the government can't really easily focus on blaming or deflecting blame to an external factor. the only thing it can actually even defend is its own response. And its own response is pretty lackluster.
Well, the other thing I would say is that had Christopher Luxon taken a principled approach to foreign affairs, as New Zealand Prime Ministers typically have in the past, and said this is a breach of international law and we oppose the action against Iran, he'd be in a much better position to say that this was someone else's doing. Instead, he flubbed around and eventually said he supported any action, which includes this.
Willis went as close as anyone has gone when she said in the media conference, "This is not our war." Right? We did not, this is a war chosen by others. Chosen was an interesting one.
And I'm not
actually.
saying it is their war,
no.
But they've not put themselves in a good position to say we oppose this and we've always been against it.
She said, "Where's the effect of this war was the choice of others." Yeah.
In fairness, Neale, that's exactly what I was just saying.
Yeah. Okay. Look, back to the.
I'm not really sure if it's much of a rebuttal.
I was just making a point, Liam. Can I just say one other thing? I think another thing they could be doing is the Greens of this morning said they should reduce public transport fares. The previous government had a policy on that. I think that would be sensible. It would be a cost of living measure that would give everyday people, middle New Zealand, options, and it would reduce demand on fuel. The government right now is forcing regional transport authorities to push fares up by demanding higher private share. They should be reducing fares right now.
Okay, Liam, just back to that issue of looking strong or looking like you've got some kind of plan or series of plans through a crisis. You can argue the toss all you like of the cause of it. We're in it. Are you seeing, you don't seem particularly impressed with what you have seen so far in terms of a plan, a step-through plan for what's happening and what could happen?
Well, it's hard to know what could be done that would be impressive, right, because of those fundamental constraints. You don't have the easy black and white narrative. You don't have the easy goal that can somehow be achieved by the government. All the solutions are long term, and all the short term relief. As you say, you can have targeted relief. Although targeted relief, perhaps generates better sound bites than it does actual results. One of the reasons why the last Labour government was so effective in terms of their initial crisis is that things like the wage subsidy weren't targeted. They were very, very broadly targeted, very, very broadly applied. And the government doesn't really have any kind of similar options where it can do anything that's going to be immediately effective.
Well, the speculation is that the Working for Families architecture might be used for some kind of support for families with children, families and work with children. And in fact, the latest round of interviews this morning suggests an announcement on that might be coming sooner rather than later, Liam.
I would be incredibly surprised if that kind of thing moves the needle in any way, any more than any of the relief that Labour promised in 2023 moved the needle for it on inflation, which just killed that government. The reality is inflation is always the incumbent killer, and there's very, very little you can do to fight it, because any relief you do promise tends to be gobbled up in the next round of price increases.
I tend to agree
with
that.
So it's just the government's really in a difficult spot.
I tend to agree with that, and the challenge with the targeted support is obviously people on low incomes, people with low incomes with families, they need support the most, and hopefully that is generous. But again, there's a lot of people who won't be covered by that, who won't feel they're getting any relief, and they're just going to be just as angry when they're filling up the car.
I mean, the public transport thing in some ways is the most logical. Of course, there's some people for whom it's not an option, but we're already seeing use go up. And the one message that we had from our global energy expert, who's seen these come and go all the way back to the Iran-Iraq war, was that, for goodness sake, don't lower the price of fuel itself. You need that price signal to work. But lowering the price of alternative forms of transport, why wouldn't you do that, Liam?
Well, would be a good move to make for the exact reason you just highlighted, right? I mean, any decrease in fuel is going to only maintain demand and make it harder to actually ration it and where it needs to be the most. But I mean, it's a very Wellington and Auckland view to see public transport. It can be very effective in those big cities, but there are so many swing voters. So many voters who will decide the election who live in provincial cities like
Can I just point out that the Ministry of Education has just paused its review on bus routes, for example. If you want to talk about provincial and rural areas, it has just pulled the plug on any forward moves to cancel rural bus routes for now. So there's an example straight away of how things could go a little bit wider. Okay, the bottom line is, And you seem ambivalent on it, Liam. Is this an opportunity for the government to shore up what has been sliding support, and National in particular, or do you see nothing but threats to that?
I see nothing but threats. There's always an opportunity in a crisis, but this is not the type of crisis that presents a lot of opportunities. There's just not a lot of opportunities to look strong. There's not a lot of opportunities to assert control, and it's difficult for the government to try and articulate some sort of shared goal that it can take the credit for. I think there's only danger for the government in these circumstances.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity in the same sense that there was for Labour with the post-COVID inflation spike.
The other matter also, and you mentioned, Willis and has the government, his National in particular, has the government backed itself into a corner over its rhetoric over spending. Fitch now having the country on back on negative watch. So again, any idea of some kind of package that might further hit the government's books?
Yeah, look, I know I bang on about this a lot, but I do think the tax cut plan was the original sin of this government, which is it was unaffordable, it was untold billions, and they knew it wasn't affordable, and they promised it anyway. And this entire term, the problems they've had in the health system, the problems they've had with underfunding, and now we have a crisis, and they've got no room to move. I think a lot of this goes back to that package, and I think there's a place for the opposition to say you're struggling, things are hard, the government's got no answers, and they say they've got no money, but they've given billions of dollars of tax cuts to landlords. And I do think there's an opportunity there for the opposition, and I do think it's why the government's boxed itself into a corner.
Mind you, how well did the opposition perform last week, would you say, Liam, in the exact same set of circumstances? Did we hear anything coming out of them that showed the kind of, confident leadership, we have the way to see us through this, that people might be looking for?
Well, not really. And I mean, there's a ready-made response to what Neale just said, which is that we've just had the COVID inquiry, phase 2 report, which pretty clearly laid out how all of the fiscal headroom that we had for future crises was basically wiped out by we talk about untold billions, 30 untold billions of low quality spending, which means that we're not really prepared for future crises, and we don't have the headroom for them, certainly. But it doesn't matter, because the opposition only has to be partly competent by default. It only has to present as an alternative. And you've got a former Prime Minister. Now, he wasn't the most popular Prime Minister in the world, but people can clearly see him in the role because he's done it before. And whatever other issues he might have had last week, it's not taking away from the idea that he's a competent alternative. And that's all an opposition needs to be.
I was just first of all, I'll just reply to one thing, which is even if you accept Liam's view on the COVID spending, National made its tax cut promise knowing that in full. But look, I think the opposition was pretty quiet last week. I would like them to say more. I would like Labour to have done what the Greens have done and made a call on public transport, for example. But as Liam says, in a crisis, the opposition doesn't really get much coverage. They need to not stuff up, as Simon Bridges found out. If they don't stuff up and they look vaguely competent, then they benefit from it.
Okay, let's have a look at what is happening in the polls. There was a better poll in the Talbot Mills for National, had it back above 30, but the RNZ poll out today, which does have National at 30.8, still has it just a shade shy of 5 percentage points behind Labour. And New Zealand First on the rise, 10.6 on its way to 11. The Greens very healthy as well. I think the PM's personal ratings are down even further. Liam, has this immediate crisis put to bed any thought that there's going to be some kind of a move against Luxon? To be fair, in this RNZ poll, there weren't many contenders doing particularly well either.
Well, I mean, I've always been pretty sceptical that would happen anyway, for exactly the reason that you've highlighted, which is that you don't change leaders until you've got someone who you know is going to continue to get all those votes and add at least one more. And it's never really been on the horizon. And I think, it's been a bad run that if some credible alternative was to emerge, then we would hear it in a more definitive way than what we've heard. Look, I think back to 2017, and there were so many talks from national supporters about how the largest party in the election, or the party that got the largest share of the vote, needs to form the government, and that any alternative is a coalition of the losers. And we're not going to hear any talk of that anymore. I think we've well and truly put that to bed, and we've really, truly, for the first, we have entered the era of pure MMP elections. And National really is going to struggle with its own image if it's going to continue to run behind and require the support of
Take your finger off mute, Liam. Come in.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Finish your
I'm
thought.
not sure what's happening.
Finish your thought. We're in a genuine MMP situation.
National self-image and self-confidence is really going to suffer if it continues to run behind Labor and can only possibly get over the line with the help of two support parties. That's not something that National's used to, and it's not going to like it.
Every Labor person I know breathes a sigh of relief whenever they see National above 30 because the last thing they want is for Luxon to get rolled. I think the most likely scenario where Chris Hipkins is Prime Minister after the election is where he's up against Christopher Luxon. So, but look, this poll, I thought there were a few interesting things. The first one was obviously Luxon down to minus 21 favourability. That's catastrophic. And only 1 in 3 New Zealanders think the country's heading in the right direction. What was particularly interesting was New Zealand First voters are even more negative on the government, even though it's part of the government. And I think Winston Peters has done quite a remarkable...
Did you hear him this morning? You wouldn't even think he was part of the government, the way he managed to separate himself from the situation.
He's managed to make himself the opposition within the government, which is remarkable because there'll be a lot of people on that centre-right who want the centre-right coalition in power who aren't ready to vote Labour for whatever reason. And New Zealand First kind of acts as a storm grate, kind of catching them on the way through. So I think actually Winston's quite well positioned there, and he's actually keeping votes in the government that would otherwise leave it.
All right. Look, speaking of the Labour leader last week, quite the conundrum for many media organisations in dealing with these social media posts by Chris Hipkins' ex-wife. Ultimately, it did become public, and he did front pretty much the moment he got off a plane from Australia. Again, we're not publishing at RNZ the substantive allegations made. They are not criminal in nature, but they are to do with what people might argue could broadly be questions of character. Does his fronting up make a big difference in terms of how this has been received?
I think he had to front up eventually because, back in the day, this story probably wouldn't have got up because the media would have looked at it and said, well, these are unsubstantiated, he denies it, we've got no way to verify it, we're not going to make potentially defamatory allegations against someone. The wild west of social media means that mainstream media is now dragged along and has to publish because it's on social media, so that makes it a story. So I think he had to address it. It's a very hard situation for him to be in as a politician because these allegations have been seen and aired widely. There's no benefit for him in detail litigating them with his ex-wife when there's no way to demonstrate it either way. And so I think he just had to front up, address the alleged affair which he put to bed. But I think he had to address it, show some humanity, and try and move past it. It's a tough one because, I think most people recognise that relationship breakups are hard. Anyone who's been through one knows that. And that often people have quite different recollections of events afterwards. I will just say personally, as someone who knows, he's not a first personal friend of mine, but I know Chris Hipkins and I know people who know him and I've worked with him and I know people who've worked with him. He's a very committed dad. The person I saw described in that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the person I know.
We can't litigate it, as we say.
But
this is the whole point.
But
his fronting up.
But I was going to say, there's no way I or anyone else can know the reality of that relationship.
Right.
And I think that just puts him in a very difficult position.
Was the fronting up an important thing to do, Liam? Give the media answer the questions and hope that's the worst it's going to get for you.
Well, it's something he had to do. It wasn't really something he had too much of a choice about. I mean, I suppose there was always the option to say nothing, but it was truly like a rock in a hard place. Barely starts to describe it. These sorts of things, I think, there is always we all agree on the principle, all right, that private lives are private lives. There is always a temptation when it's someone who is, your political opponent to try to rationalise, to try to find some exception, to find some sort of reason for why, in this case, it's got any sort of public, importance. But it's so important to always fight against that temptation, no matter who is on the receiving end of it. Couples break up, and in the era of social media, couples will air their bitter feelings about that on social media. And the absolute discipline that we need to not drag it into the public is something that we have to figure out. I think that Hipkins did what he had to do. I'm not sure that he wasn't able to turn the situation around. I think, it's never edifying to see a public figure sort of teary or on the verge of tears. And while for some people that might sort of be sort of humanizing to him, for other people it's a turn off, especially people who don't like public shows of emotion. But what else could he do? I found the whole thing completely distasteful.
What I found interesting was I haven't seen, apart from I don't know what's happened on social media, I haven't seen a single MP climb into this. And this comes back to what has always been, and you see it in the House, if anyone ever goes within cooey of referencing a family member in the House, there is a reaction, right? And it was very interesting that at that level anyway.
And I do think
there's
a broader challenge here with social media, and we saw this with the allegations against Clark Gayford that with Jacinda faced, and we saw this with Benjamin Doyle. Who on earth in their right mind would enter public office in this environment? I mean, whenever I talk to somebody who says they're thinking about entering Parliament, I say on a here's the reasons you should, but on a personal level, are you mad? What are you thinking? Don't do that to yourself and your family. And I'm just convinced of that advice when I see this.
All right, just finally, Winston Peters' speech yesterday, and perhaps the standout from it was New Zealand First kind of confirming what they've been leaning towards, but actually proposing a breakup of the electricity gentailers. Now, again, for an incumbent minister in an incumbent government, not insignificant to do. Potentially, would you say, Liam, a popular policy for those who on the face of it think it might be the solution to high energy prices?
Yeah, it was a really interesting speech, I thought, and for a whole lot of reasons. So the last couple of years, we've had Winston Peters really turning up the dial on sort of the war on woke or sort of the culture war issues. And I think in having sort of secured that part of the vote and being in quite a strong position compared to how New Zealand First normally is, coming off a term in government, the pivot to the economic populism is the right move to make in terms of the politics, if not the economics of it. He's done a very good job of keeping himself very distinct from the government over the last 3 years, and he really sort of tended to double down on that. Though he criticised Labour in the media more than National, but it was a very, very, I thought, disciplined, focused speech. I think that it was the right move for him to pivot to the economy. He's got the sort of the culture warfare votes in his pocket, and he can only antagonise future potential voters by continuing to double down on that. So I think
he managed to get a hair colour reference in for whatever that value was, and then we were back to the electricity. Yeah.
One speech is a really you can't put too much on it, but as a direction of travel, it's the smart play. So he's being well advised.
The attraction of the policy as well, Neale, and again you'll hear all sorts come back from the sector about what the chilling effect that might have on investment and all these kinds of things. But as a pure pitch to the public,
and my firm does some work for energy companies, but there's always my opinions on my own. I think Winston Peters and Shane Jones, who's been a driver of this, have recognised that cost of living is the number one issue by far. People are concerned about their energy bills, are frustrated, angry. And Shane Jones, he's talked about this before, he's very good at the politics of identifying a villain and attaching people's problems to that villain and polarising and going hard. And I think they've managed to do that here, and I think it'll play very well with the voters thereafter.
Thanks both of you very much. That is Neale Jones and Liam Hehir.